By the spring of 1846, Caleb Morgan had already buried 2 friends, burned 3 shelters to the ground himself, and seen what Apache warriors could do to a man who wasn't ready. He'd stopped talking much about the war, even when the whiskey was flowing. Folks around the Pecos settlements only knew he'd fought with the 2nd Dragoons in Florida, back when the Seminole War taught him not just how to shoot, but how to vanish. He'd learned to move silent through palmetto and cypress, how to tell the shape of a man's breath from 50 yards, how to sleep without fire and wake at the snap of a twig. But none of that mattered much now. Out here, west of the Rio Grande, those old tricks were only part of what it took to stay alive. And Caleb had no illusions about the odds. The territory east of the Organ Mountains was wide and empty, broken only by wind-gnawed rock and scattered cottonwoods. It was land that punished mistakes. And Caleb, though younger than he looked, carried the posture of a man who'd already run out of chances. He'd watched too many settlers throw up cabins like they were staking claims on a dream, not a battlefield. Square walls, single door, window on each side. That kind of thinking got people killed. The Apaches weren't stupid. They watched, they learned. They remembered which kind of roof meant a white man lived below it, and whether that man was worth the risk. Caleb had no illusions about being a hero. He wanted something else. He wanted silence, to be left alone, to build something that didn't invite attack, not because it was hidden, not because it looked humble, but because it warned. It started with a map drawn in the dust. Caleb didn't trust paper anymore. He dragged his finger through the dirt beside the fire, drawing angles and arcs while the wind pushed ash across the design. What he sketched that night wasn't a cabin, not exactly. It was a shell, a trap, a declaration, one that said, if you come here, you won't leave whole. By summer, the rumors started. A few cowhands passing through El Cielo station said there was a veteran building something strange in the East Hills. They said he hauled stones alone in the heat and hammered nails at night by moonlight. A trapper swore he saw a narrow ditch ringing the place, with iron stakes sunk into rock like the points of a crown. No one had seen the cabin up close, and that was the point. But before the mystery, before the whispers, before the cabin was finished, there was the girl and the fire. Her name was Ruth, 14 years old, daughter of a preacher who'd believed too much in providence and not enough in preparation. Caleb had passed their wagon twice during that fateful journey north through the Jornada. He remembered the old man nodding, Bible on his knee, rifle beside his son. He remembered the woman coughing in the back of the wagon. He remembered Ruth's eyes, clear, blue, and too calm for someone that young in that kind of heat. It was 10 days after they passed his camp that he found the remains, smoke curling from a canyon entrance, the smell of char and blood. He didn't have to see it to know what happened. The Apaches had been quiet all season, but quiet didn't mean gone. Caleb approached slow. He found the preacher face down in the creek bed, his back opened like meat. The mother was still inside the wagon, eyes wide, her mouth frozen mid-prayer. The boy was gone, and Ruth was alive, barely. They'd cut her face, but left her breathing. Caleb carried her out with one arm and burned the wagon with the other. He didn't say a word to the girl for the first 2 days, just gave her water, kept the fire low, and watched the hills. She didn't speak either, just stared at the flames like she saw ghosts inside them. It was Ruth who changed his mind. He'd planned to keep moving, go south, disappear. But every time he looked at the girl's face, scarred, silent, watching, he saw too much of the old world in her. And none of it would survive out here unless someone built a place that made men think twice. So he stayed, and he built. He didn't start with walls, he started with ground. Caleb found a rise east of an arroyo that ran dry in summer but swelled hard in spring. From the ridge, he could see both the pass and the high trails the Apache scouts used. The soil was packed clay over limestone, hard to dig, but it drained well. He set stakes in a triangle, not a square. The triangle pointed northeast, its flat side facing the most likely approach path. Inside that triangle, he marked a central core, 10 by 10 feet, sunk 2 feet into the earth. Then came the stone. Caleb quarried rock by hand, dragging slabs across the clay with ropes and brute will. He built the foundation first, not just a ring of stones, but a full perimeter wall, 3 feet high, mortared with a mix of crushed limestone and ash. Into the gaps, he drove nails and splinters of oak soaked in pitch. These weren't decorative, they were blade breakers, arrow splitters. If you rushed the wall, you'd leave blood on it. Then he layered. Instead of upright logs like most cabins, Caleb laid thick horizontal beams of cedar, each hewn flat and notched to fit tightly. He treated the ends with boiled linseed and bear fat. Between the beams, he packed dried yucca fiber, soaked in a mixture of silt and charred bone. The result was flexible, water-resistant, and nearly airtight. But the real trick was what went inside the walls. Between every third beam, Caleb embedded iron bands, long strips he'd scavenged from an abandoned stagecoach wreck and reshaped at night in a pit forge. These bands ran through the walls like ligaments. You couldn't see them from the outside, but they changed everything. You couldn't axe through a wall like that. Couldn't burn it easily either. For the roof, he built low and heavy, sloped gently, covered with overlapping bark and canvas, then packed earth, then a second layer of bark. From a distance, it looked like a rise in the land. Up close, it was a shield. Rain couldn't soak it, arrows couldn't pierce it, and fire would smother on it. Inside, there was no open hearth. Caleb built a vented firebox of stone sunk into the center of the floor. It burned hot and low, fed by side channels that drew air through ducts carved into the floor itself. The smoke passed through a buried flue that exited 20 feet downslope, invisible among rocks. From the outside, you'd never see smoke. From the inside, you'd feel warmth in the floor and walls, not in the air. The door wasn't wood, it was stone, hinged with iron pins and counterweighted so it could be pulled shut with a rope. A man could not bash it down, not with an axe, not with fire, and it was set 3 feet back from the outer wall, forming a kill zone, narrow, dark, impossible to enter without exposing yourself. Ruth watched all of this in silence. She'd begun to speak again, a little at a time, asking questions mostly. Why the door was so narrow, why the floor had holes, why he slept with his boots on. He answered in fragments. Let her draw conclusions. They'll come back, she said one night, as the wind howled outside. He didn't answer, just kept sharpening his blade. When the Apaches did return, it wasn't like he expected. It was late October. The winds had shifted. The sky had that flat yellow look that meant snow wouldn't wait much longer. Caleb was finishing the outer pit traps, concealed hollows lined with thorned agave stalks, disguised with branches. He heard the whistle before he saw the shadow. 3 riders, painted, watching. They didn't approach, just circled once, twice, then vanished into the hills. 2 nights later, he found tracks at the edge of the perimeter. Bare feet, deliberate steps, testing. He waited for 3 days. Then they came. 6 men, moving fast, quiet as mist. But Caleb had set the ground to speak. Loose gravel where no man walked. Iron filings in the brush to catch torchlight. Triggered noisemakers strung to silent bells inside. When the first man stepped on the gravel, Caleb was already at the wall slit. He didn't shoot, just watched. The warrior froze, looked around, whispered to the others. Then the door creaked open. Not his door. The pit, the trap Caleb had rigged with a weighted log, swung up, not down. The warrior saw it a second too late. The thud of impact echoed like a drum, then silence. The others vanished, gone in less than 10 heartbeats. They didn't return, not that week, not that season. And from that winter forward, Caleb's cabin stood untouched. But that wasn't the end, because Ruth had ideas too. When the frost set in for real, thickening the clay seams in the cabin walls and frosting the stone lintel above the door, Ruth stopped asking questions. Caleb noticed. Her gaze shifted too often to the hills. Her hands fiddled with the same strip of rawhide over and over. Silence hung heavier than snow, and Caleb knew the kind of silence she carried. It wasn't born from fear, it was the silence of calculation, of remembering, of stitching pieces together that never quite fit anymore. And in that silence, she began to change. Caleb had expected her to grieve. He expected her to falter under the weight of what she'd seen, maybe even beg to be taken back to some semblance of civilization. Instead, Ruth watched. She memorized. She began carving things in a spiral notebook she must have taken from her father's pack. Sketches of the cabin's crossbeams, angles of the pit traps, diagrams of vent flows. She didn't speak about the ambush. She never spoke of her brother, but Caleb saw the edge forming in her, sharp, determined, a girl who would never again be taken by surprise. That winter passed without a single skirmish, but Caleb remained on edge. The Apaches weren't gone. They didn't forget a man who'd bloodied one of their own. They just waited, tested, watched. Every few weeks, he'd find signs, a broken twig in a place no animal passed, ashes scattered too wide for a cooking fire, stones shifted in a way no wind could explain. They were still out there, but they weren't attacking, not yet. And in that uncertain space between retreat and reprisal, Caleb kept building. The outer perimeter was his next focus. Most cabins relied on visibility, clearing brush to see danger coming. But Caleb had learned that vision was a double-edged sword. If he could see them, they could see him. So he built deception into the land itself. He started with the deadline, a false clearing surrounding the cabin that looked like any typical defensive buffer. Flat, open, free of cover. But just beyond that ring, Caleb planted obstacles. Natural-looking growths made from sagebrush tied around sharpened willow stakes. Low-lying tripwires that would tug taut and release signal bells beneath the floor, a ring of charred brush from a fake fire pit, except beneath that ash was a cache of tar and dry pine resin, ready to ignite with the toss of a single ember. It was layered, deceptive, and completely silent. He called it the quiet circle. Inside that circle, every movement whispered something. A displaced stone meant someone tried stepping over the trip line. A bent sapling meant someone had tested the snare. Even animal tracks became markers. If a deer had wandered through and wasn't there the next morning, it meant something had scared it away. Caleb didn't sleep fully that winter. He dozed in shifts, boots on, rifle across his chest, and Ruth doing the same 2 walls away. By January, Ruth had begun crafting additions. She stitched a thick hide panel that hung over the cabin's lone window slit, not just for warmth, but dyed in a pattern that matched the surrounding rock, making it disappear from view, even in bright moonlight. She helped dig the narrow trench from the buried flue all the way to a second exhaust vent. 20 yards downslope, a decoy to fool anyone watching smoke plumes. Caleb never told her to do any of this. She just did it, like she'd made some private vow with the blood of her family, still drying in her memory. One night, while wind rattled the high pines and the air inside the cabin tasted of smoke and iron, Ruth finally spoke again. "If they come back," she said, voice low but steady, "don't make it fast." Caleb looked over from the corner where he was lashing a new crossbow from scavenged wagon iron. He didn't reply, just nodded, then tightened the next bolt with careful precision. The trapline Caleb set that spring wasn't just for defense, it was a message. He designed it to be discovered. The shallow snares were obvious, the pit markings visible if you looked close. The spring-loaded spikes he camouflaged just enough to catch attention. He wanted them to know the place was prepared, over-prepared, paranoid even. He wanted the Apaches to feel it every time they got within sight of the cabin, that they weren't walking into a settlement, they were walking into a gauntlet, and it worked. By late March, signs of their presence faded. No more track marks, no more broken branches or cut grass. It was as if they'd redrawn their maps and simply left the area blank, not from fear, but from understanding. The cabin had become something else. Locals began to take notice. A trader from Mesilla came through with a wagon full of mule harnesses and saw the stone tower rising above the roofline. He asked if Caleb was building a church. Caleb said nothing. Another time, a pair of surveyors heading east to Fort Fillmore passed by and asked to sketch the place for their military logbooks. Caleb denied them. Word still spread. A cabin built like a fortress, a girl with a scarred face and the posture of a sharpshooter. A man who once fought Seminoles now building the kind of place even warriors steered clear of. By summer, the rains came, and with them, the next test, flooding. The arroyo swelled faster than Caleb had expected. Rains that began gently turned violent in the space of an hour, and the valley filled with the roar of white water and earth-churned debris. But the cabin held. Its raised stone foundation, angled to deflect runoff, stood firm while mud slid down from the hills. The drainage trench he'd carved months earlier channeled water away in 2 directions, one toward the natural wash, the other toward a buried rock field that filtered and slowed it. Other settlers weren't so lucky. A family 5 miles downriver lost their roof when runoff undermined their cabin's back wall. Caleb found them 2 days later, soaked, cold, and hungry. He brought them to his place, let them sleep under the earthen roof, fed them from the cured venison he and Ruth had smoked over coals all spring. When they left, they begged to stay. Caleb told them no, not out of cruelty, but because his place wasn't a refuge. It was a line in the sand. "More people," Ruth said afterward, watching the family disappear down the canyon path. "Means more mouths, more noise?" Caleb nodded. "More risk." Ruth stared at the far ridge where the Apaches had once stood. "Maybe that's the point." She didn't say more, but Caleb caught the meaning. That summer, they improved everything. Reinforced the roof with interlaced branches to prevent cave-ins, built stone shelves into the walls so nothing touched the damp earth, planted thornbush hedges at choke points in the path. They even installed a kind of chimney baffle, adjustable plates inside the flue to control smoke draw. No settler cabin had such things. No military fort within 200 miles had a design that clever. By August, the air was still and silence once again draped the valley. That's when the messenger came, a scout from Fort Fillmore, thin, tired, riding a limping Mustang. He came to warn Caleb that something was stirring. Raids had picked up across the territory. 3 ranches burned in 1 week, 2 wagon parties gone missing. Apache war parties were moving again, only this time with more coordination, more silence, more intent. "They're not raiding for food," the scout said. "They're proving something." Caleb didn't ask what. He already knew. That fall, Ruth added one last feature to the cabin. A mural. She carved it with a hunting knife into the inner door. A sunburst, split with 3 arrows, each wrapped in vines. Beneath it, she inscribed one word in Apache. Twogi. It meant enough. When Caleb asked her where she'd learned it, she shrugged, said she remembered hearing it, maybe from a trader, maybe from one of the men who hurt her family, maybe not. Caleb didn't press. He just sealed the door behind her and returned to sharpening the knives. Because winter was coming again, and with it, the ghosts. The first ghost came with the snow, not a phantom in the wind, not some pale figure drifting through campfire smoke. It was a sound, one Caleb hadn't heard since Florida. A bone whistle, high, soft, mournful, carried on the cold air like breath through through hollow reed. It wasn't the note itself that chilled him. It was the memory. The last time he'd heard it, a friend had been cut down 2 feet away, his throat opened by a blade Caleb never saw coming. The Seminoles had used those whistles to signal movement without speech. So did the Apaches. Caleb heard it at twilight. A single note, no follow-up, no reply. He was up before the fire dimmed, rifle in hand, boots laced, Ruth already awake and kneeling by the door. Her eyes weren't wide. They were steady, focused, like she'd known this was coming. "They're testing," she said. Caleb didn't respond, just nodded. They both moved through the cabin like gears in a machine long oiled by repetition. The first wall slits were checked, then the traps, reset where needed, dusted where covered by snowfall. Caleb relaid the gravel bed near the entry path, the one that cracked audibly when disturbed. Ruth lit the smudge fire that would curl low smoke from the decoy flew down slope, making it seem like they were unarmed and foolish. Every motion was deliberate, nothing wasted. By midnight, the air turned so still, the flames in their hidden hearth stopped flickering. That was the second sign. The forest always whispered, even in cold. When it stopped, something was near. Then came the third sign. A stone, no bigger than a peach, rolled against the side wall, not tossed, rolled, deliberate. It clinked once, then silence again. Caleb moved to the side slit and saw nothing, just the slope, the brush, untouched. But he knew better. The Apache weren't ghosts, but they might as well have been. They moved low, silent, used the land like another layer of skin. The stone was not a threat, it was a statement. "We see you." And then, the fourth sign. Smoke, not theirs, not from the cabin, from the ridge. A controlled burn, small, meant for signal, meant to be seen. Ruth stepped beside him, holding the spyglass they'd salvaged from a Mexican cart runner a year back. She peered into the distance and let out a slow breath. "It's not just scouts," she said. "They're watching from 3 sides. Caleb took the glass, angled it toward the ridge. He saw it too, dark figures, motionless, standing. They weren't hiding, they wanted to be seen. Caleb moved to the back wall, unlatched the first panel he'd designed for exactly this event, an escape hatch camouflaged behind a cedar panel. He pulled it wide, exposing a tunnel that led 40 feet under packed dirt and out past the rear slope, toward a ravine, not for fleeing, for flanking. He looked at Ruth. She shook her head. "No, we don't run." He waited a beat, then closed the hatch. For the rest of that night, they didn't speak again. By dawn, the watchers were gone, the smoke extinguished, the ridge empty, but the air was different now, heavier. They'd been marked. For the next 2 days, Caleb did what he'd always done before a fight. He refined. Every tripwire was retied, not just checked. Every trap wasn't just reset. It was doubled, then disguised with a new level of cruelty. Punji pits under a layer of brittle grass. A coiled deadfall rigged with a boulder balanced against a carved notch. Even the food stores were reburied, twice in 2 locations, with no obvious signs. If the cabin fell, there would be fallback options. But the truth sat in Caleb's stomach like hot iron. If they attacked, it wouldn't be like before. This would be coordinated and brutal. But something else was stirring now. A shift in Ruth. Each night she slept closer to the door. She wore the scar on her face like a badge, not a wound. She sharpened her knives longer than necessary, watched the woods more than the fire, and she started sketching again, more than just beams and traps now. She drew people, faces, memories. She drew the man she saw kill her brother. She drew the pattern of paint he wore, and then tore the page out and nailed it to the inside of the door with a piece of bloodwood. When Caleb saw it, he didn't ask. He simply nodded and handed her the powder horn. What came next wasn't a battle. It was a message. On the 3rd night, a torch was thrown at the cabin. It came from the southern rise, the side most sheltered by wind, meant to catch the edge of the roof. It hit clean, flared, then died. The earth-packed roof refused flame. The torch hissed and rolled off like a matchstick thrown at a stone. Ruth laughed, a short, sharp thing. Caleb didn't smile. He was already at the flanking tunnel again, lifting the door. This time he didn't close it. They went out together. They moved low, with soot smeared across their faces, Ruth carrying the stubby carbine, and Caleb the curved iron knife he'd taken off a Seminole fighter a decade prior. The snow was soft, which meant tracks, but they weren't going to hide. They were going to return the message. They reached the southern rise in 7 minutes. The brush there was still warm. No fire had taken, but the footprints were fresh. 2 men, one heavier, one small and barefoot. Caleb pointed to the second. Ruth nodded. They followed the path. 50 yards deeper into the trees, they saw the sentry. He was sitting, not standing, watching the cabin through a gap in the trees. Young, maybe 15. Ruth lifted the carbine. Caleb held up a hand. They waited. 10 minutes passed. Then the boy stood and began to move back into the brush. Caleb tapped Ruth's shoulder. They returned the way they came. When they got back to the cabin, Caleb took one of the stones from the outer wall, flat, oval-shaped, and scratched a symbol onto it. Not letters, not numbers. A circle, split once. He placed it outside the perimeter, facing the rise. Ruth watched. "They'll know what it means," she said. Caleb nodded. It meant, "Come again, and it won't be the boy who dies." For 5 days after, nothing moved in the valley. No birds, no deer, no wind. Then a gift, a bundle left on the ridge. Inside, a small animal skull, a strip of leather with 2 knots, and a red-streaked feather. Ruth translated it aloud. "They won't return, but they watched. They know." Caleb stared at the offering for a long time. "They're not afraid," he said. "No," Ruth agreed, "but they respect it." That night, Caleb added one final touch to the cabin. A hand-carved totem, staked into the earth in front of the door. It wasn't Apache. It wasn't any tribe symbol. It was his own. 2 crossed rifles beneath an open eye. A warning and a promise. The Apaches didn't return, but word of the cabin spread faster than before. Traders began whispering about the place, built by a ghost. Others said the girl inside wasn't human anymore, that she saw things before they happened, that her knife never missed. A scout from Santa Fe rode out just to see if the rumors were true. He never reached the door. He turned around 100 yards out. No one told him to. No threat was made. But something in the air told him enough. This was a place you did not enter unless invited. And Caleb and Ruth? They didn't invite anyone. By the summer of 1847, the cabin had taken on a reputation that even the surrounding land seemed to respect. The air along the ridgeline grew still when travelers approached. Coyotes stopped howling within earshot. The few deer that wandered close veered off without reason. Nature, it seemed, had learned the same lesson the Apache had. Something about that place was wrong, or perhaps simply unwelcoming in a way even predators understood. Caleb Morgan hadn't built a home. He'd forged a monument to refusal. And Ruth? She was no longer the girl who'd sat silent after the fire. She had become something sharper, a coiled wire with a steady pulse. She wore the land the way other girls wore dresses, and it moved with her like it knew she belonged. But peace doesn't last on a frontier. The first rider to test the silence came from the west. Not an Apache, not a settler. A stranger in black, lean and slow-moving, riding a painted mare with flanks marked by healed scars. He appeared just after noon on a heat-hazed July day. The sun was cruel that week. The ground cracked underfoot. Water sat shallow in the arroyos. Everything felt brittle, even the air. Ruth saw him first, through the spyglass, sitting atop the ridge where the signal smoke had once curled. He made no effort to hide. Caleb didn't reach for his rifle. Not yet. He just watched. The man stayed there for 3 hours, motionless. Then he turned and vanished down the slope without ever approaching. 2 days later, a wooden box appeared at the edge of the perimeter. No footprints, no trail, just the box, and a single word carved into its lid, "Ghost." Ruth opened it with a stick. Inside was a piece of canvas neatly folded, with an old U.S. Dragoon insignia painted in flaking black. Caleb didn't say anything, just stared at it, then took it to the fire and burned it, because he recognized the signature hidden beneath the fold. W.H. Kearns. The name hit like a stone through glass, a name he hadn't heard since the thick swamps of the Alachua. The man had been his commander once, but he was no leader. Kearns had been a butcher in uniform, fond of sending boys into the brush while he sat behind the line, dry and safe. When the raids got bad, and the orders crueler, Caleb had walked away, just disappeared. Men like Kearns didn't forget a thing like that, especially when they were humiliated by it. "He's found me," Caleb said at last. Ruth didn't blink. "Will he come?" Caleb nodded once. "Not alone." That summer turned from dry to blistering. The wind blew sand that flayed the bark from the junipers. Water had to be pulled deep from the earth, bucket by bucket. Ruth stopped sleeping more than a few hours at a time. Caleb set the traps again, not for Apache this time, but for men who thought they understood war, who thought uniforms protected them from consequence. Kearns didn't show up for 3 more weeks, but when he did, he brought 5 men and a wagon. The wagon didn't carry supplies. It carried a cannon. They stopped just beyond rifle range, set up camp like they had all the time in the world. The cannon they positioned dead center, pointed at the cabin's front wall. A loud message. "We could take this place apart in minutes." Caleb knew better. The walls he'd built weren't just logs and mortar. They were reinforced from within. Stone baffles packed behind each beam, buried steel plates scavenged from wrecks and covered in mud to avoid reflection. And beneath the cabin, the earth had been shaped over years. Dug out, layered, backfilled. Any force large enough to break it would have to get close first. Too close. Ruth watched them through the spyglass. The men laughed often, swung hammers lazily, drove spikes into the dirt, pitched a wide canvas tent with military precision. "Mercenaries?" she asked. Caleb nodded. "Or deserters?" Kearns never earned loyalty. That night, they cooked over open flame, sang songs, made no effort to stay quiet. Caleb watched every movement. Ruth mapped their positions on the back wall in charcoal. Then came the summons. At dawn, one of the men approached, holding a white scrap tied to his rifle barrel. Ruth aimed the carbine, tracking him with surgical calm. Caleb waved her off. The man stopped 10 yards from the perimeter. "Major Kearns requests a parley," he called. "He assures no harm will come if you come out unarmed." Caleb stepped into the open, far enough to be seen, but not close enough to give them comfort. "Tell your major if he wants a word. He knows where the line is." The messenger looked confused. "What line?" Caleb pointed to the gravel border. "Tell him to cross it." The man left. The message was delivered. Kearns didn't come that day. He came the next. No escort, just him. He walked up to the edge of the perimeter and stopped at the gravel. Didn't cross, just stood there, boots kicking dust, hands on his hips like he was deciding whether to knock on a door or kick it down. Caleb stood in the threshold, arms folded, no weapon in sight. But Ruth was inside, behind the first slit, watching every breath. "You built a damn fort," Kearns said. Caleb didn't speak. The major looked around. "They say even the Apache won't touch this place." Still, no reply. "You know, I always said you were too clever for your own good, Morgan. Always 1 foot outside the line. Now you've gone and made yourself a legend." Caleb's expression didn't change. "Why are you here?" Kearns smiled. "Heard you'd survived. Got curious. Thought maybe we could bury old hatchets. Start something new. The Army needs places like this. Fortified positions. Safe havens. We could make you an offer." "No," Kearns blinked. "No?" he echoed. Caleb stepped forward. "This isn't for sale. It's not a post. It's not a prize. It's a wall." Kearns's smile vanished. "You think you've built something that can't be touched? Everything breaks, Caleb. Stone, wood, men. You think you've scared the Apache? Good, but I'm not them." He turned to go, then paused. "I'll leave in 2 days," he said over his shoulder. "If I'm not welcomed in by then, I'll take it." He left the same way he came, alone. But Caleb knew it wouldn't end there. That night they prepared for war. Not a siege, not a skirmish. War. They dug fire pits across the ridgeline, pockets lined with oil-soaked reeds that would burst into flame with a single match. Ruth strung iron wire across the approach path, rigged to pull free and snap tight like a whip. Caleb adjusted the flue so smoke would vent backward, out through a decoy outlet near the north ridge. He filled jars with pitch and set them in alcoves behind the wall slits. Poor man's grenades to shatter and spread flame. And below the floorboards, Caleb unlocked the vault, a cavity carved in stone, sealed with ash and mortar. Inside, wrapped in cloth, the last gift from the Seminole campaign, a single cast-iron mortar, primitive, cracked, but still functional, loaded with black powder, sealed with lard. He placed it just beneath the floor plate nearest the front wall, and waited. The next day passed in silence. Kearns didn't move. His men lounged near the cannon, polishing boots, tightening straps. Ruth paced the floor. "Why doesn't he just attack?" Caleb looked out through the slit. "Because he wants us to surrender first." That night, Caleb didn't sleep. He sat by the hearth, rifle on his lap, eyes on the door. Ruth slept 2 hours, then woke and took his place. Just before dawn, they heard it. The grind of the cannon wheels turning, the soft thud of boots repositioning, the scrape of metal. Caleb reached for the trigger line tied to the mortar's primer. Ruth nodded once. Then a call from the dark. "Last chance, Morgan." He didn't reply. Then came the boom. The cannon fired. It hit the front wall dead center and stopped. The reinforced timber barely shuddered. Then Caleb pulled the line. The mortar beneath the floor shrieked upward through the hatch and exploded 5 feet above the trench line. The blast was sudden. The effect total. Shrapnel tore through the night air. A scream. 2 men down. The rest scattered. Kearns shouted. Caleb didn't wait. He triggered the pitch jars, one by one, lighting the fire pits, as Ruth tossed the first jar of flaming tar. The night lit up like hell, opening its mouth. Kearns fled. By sunrise, the camp was gone. All that remained was the cannon, tilted on its side, one wheel missing, and the air, still and silent once again. Ruth sat on the step, blood on her face from a cut she hadn't noticed. "Is it over?" she asked. Caleb looked to the ridge. "No," he said, "but he won't come back soon." Ruth nodded and went inside to sharpen her blade. Kearns didn't die that night. He didn't lose his hand, or his sight, or even much of his pride, though 2 of the men he brought bled out in the dirt within minutes of the mortar blast. Caleb had no illusions that the man would limp off into obscurity, licking his wounds in silence. No, Kearns was a different breed. He wasn't a war dog. He was a bureaucrat in brass buttons, a tactician with a long strong memory and enough political sway to make trouble from 100 miles away. He would retreat, regroup, and wait for the right opportunity to strike again, not just with gunpowder and men, but with papers, with orders, with whispers in the ears of generals who'd never smelled blood in real soil. And that was the more dangerous storm, the one you couldn't shoot. But for the moment, silence held. In the days that followed, the charred ridge bore the black stubble of fire. Birds returned slowly, cautiously. Even the deer crept back, stepping around the blood-stained patches of ash near the gravel line. Caleb and Ruth didn't speak much. They dismantled what traps had been triggered, checked the deeper perimeter for signs of return, and buried the remains of the two fallen men with little ceremony. Enemies or not, a body left above ground drew worse things than crows. Caleb placed stones over the graves and marked them not with names, but with a single etching, a broken circle crossed by a line. The same sign Ruth had carved months ago. 2 weeks passed, then 3. Ruth spent her mornings reinforcing the slits in the southern wall, adding crossbars that could be unlatched in seconds to turn a viewing hole into a firing slit. She had begun to change her wardrobe too. No more loose frontier dresses or patched linen. She wore buckskin now, dyed dark and tight woven, and carried a small knife tucked into her boot that Caleb hadn't given her. She wasn't trying to become a woman of the West. She was trying to become a shadow in it, and she was succeeding. Caleb watched this without comment, but he kept notes in his head: how she moved, where she chose to sleep, which weapons she cleaned first. One evening, he found a new set of sketches in her journal, half covered beneath the hide she used to sit on. These weren't just drawings of the cabin's interior. These were modifications, alternate ways of building, methods of layering walls with clay-lined canvas, insulating rooftops with scorched sand sealed between bark. She was improving on what he had made. It didn't feel like betrayal. It felt like evolution, but something was shifting. The air carried a pressure that didn't belong to weather. Birds were flying higher than usual. Tracks of larger predators, mountain lions, bears, were showing up farther downslope, avoiding the valley altogether. Caleb noticed fire ants migrating early. Ruth noted that the pinyon pines were sapping heavy, bleeding too early in the season. Signs. The land knew before men did, and then the visitors came. Not raiders, not soldiers, families. 3 wagons appeared in late August, led by a man named Thorne, a gaunt ex-miner with a scorched left hand and a cough that never quite cleared. Behind him rode his wife, 2 sons, a widowed brother, and a boy so pale and thin he looked like he'd grown in the dark. Their oxen were weak, their wagons made of reclaimed parts. They weren't settlers, they were survivors, dragging themselves across the frontier like bones across slate. They didn't beg to stay. They didn't even ask directly. Thorne stood at the edge of the perimeter, eyes hollow but defiant, and said, "We heard about a place that don't burn, a place that don't fall." Caleb stood in the doorway, said nothing. Thorne nodded like that was answer enough. They camped outside the line. 3 days, didn't cross once, didn't even gather firewood from the slope. They respected the boundary more than most men respected the Sabbath. Ruth watched them carefully. She noticed the boy, the sickly one, staring at the cabin's chimney for hours at a time, not with fear, with study, like he was learning it. On the 4th day, the woman, Thorne's wife, collapsed. Caleb fetched her himself, carried her through the threshold, laid her on the stone bench Ruth had padded with goat hide and dried moss. She was burning up, fever from a wound on her leg, poorly bandaged and infected deep. Caleb cleaned it. Ruth fetched water. They didn't ask if the family could stay. They stayed. The transformation began slowly. Caleb cut cedar logs for a second structure, smaller, simpler, an auxiliary hut set 50 yards south of the cabin. He laid the foundation with Ruth's help and framed the walls with Thorne's oldest son, a boy named Elijah, who spoke little and swung an axe like he hated the wood. The others helped as they could. The pale boy, Asa, turned out to be sharp. He'd grown up in books, and though his hands were useless for chopping, he could read blueprints like a seasoned builder. Ruth took to him quickly. They began drawing together in the evenings, adding ideas to her sketches: alternative support beams, angled trenches for flood drainage, rotating slits for firing lines. By the end of September, 2 new structures stood. One was the auxiliary hut. The other was something else entirely. A storehouse built into the earth itself, half buried, with a thick clay roof supported by cedar joists and a packed gravel floor. It was Ruth's idea. Temperature-controlled, flood-resistant, invisible from a distance. They packed it with dried meat, salt, flint, cloth and spare powder, everything that could be spared. A survival pod, a legacy vault, in case everything else burned, because they all knew peace was not permanent. In mid-October, A man arrived on horseback, alone. He didn't speak as he approached. He rode a dark roan with a military cut and carried no pack, just a saber and a Springfield musket. He stopped outside the gravel line and stared at the cabin for a full minute before removing his hat. He was young, barely 25, his face smooth, eyes bright with something like awe. "You, Caleb Morgan?" he asked. Caleb nodded from the doorway. The young man swallowed. "I was told to give you this." He reached into his coat and pulled a small tin. Inside it, a rolled paper, folded and stamped with a crude wax seal. Caleb took it, read it, then burned it without a word. The rider didn't ask questions. He just turned his horse and rode back the way he came. Ruth waited until nightfall before she asked, "What did it say?" Caleb sat by the hearth, fingers loose on his knees. "That Kearns was reassigned, east, ordered out. And he left a warning, said others will come, not for me, for what I built." Ruth stared into the flames. "They want it. They'll try to take it." She nodded. "We'll build more." Caleb turned to her, eyes hard but calm. "We're not building a village?" Ruth's jaw tensed. "Then what are we building?" Caleb didn't answer, but outside, in the dark, a figure moved. Elijah had taken up sentry duty. He'd carved a post on the ridge and stood watch each night with a spyglass, a pair of flares, and a horn carved from buffalo bone. It was a signal system they'd created together. 1 blast for animal, 2 for people, 3 for threat. So when the horn sounded 3 times in rapid succession, there was no confusion. Everyone moved. Ruth had her carbine in seconds. Thorne grabbed his revolver, old and rust-pitted but loaded. The pale boy crouched in the doorway with a flare, ready to ignite if needed. Caleb didn't speak, just moved to the rear slit and watched. Shadows, dozens of them, moving low, fast, not Apache, not soldiers, raiders, mixed bloods, outlaws, men who didn't answer to anyone. Kearns had stirred the hornet's nest, and now they'd found the hive. Caleb raised one hand, counted them silently. 12, maybe 15. No cannon this time, just speed and numbers. He looked at Ruth. She nodded and lit the first pit. The fire bloomed fast, casting a red halo across the approach. The raiders scattered, but 2 fell into the trap. Punji sticks driven deep, layered in 3 tiers. A scream, a shout, gunfire erupted. The second flare went up. Elijah called positions from the ridge. They moved like clockwork. Thorne covered the west wall. Ruth took the front. Caleb held the back, waiting for the flanking team he knew would come. And they did. 3 men tried the rear tunnel, just like Kearns had done. But this time, the tunnel was different. It collapsed the moment the 3rd man crawled halfway in, crushed beneath a lattice of rock and sandbags triggered by a false floor. Caleb fired once. Silence returned, but it wasn't over. Not yet. A new noise rang out, high, mechanical, metallic, a wind-up mechanism, a grind. They had brought a crank-fired volley gun, set it on the ridge. Elijah saw it first, blew the horn twice. Caleb sprinted for the auxiliary hut, where they'd hidden the black powder barrels. He lit the fuse with steady hands, then ran. The blast knocked the gun sideways, sending smoke and screams into the stars. The raiders fled, every last one. They didn't return, and this time no offering was left, no skulls, no feathers, just ash. The land was quiet again, but Caleb knew this was only the beginning. The fires burned for 3 days. Thick black smoke curled into the cold blue sky and left a scar over the hills that no weather could wash away. It stained the rocks and darkened the trees. It stained memory, and it changed the valley. No one spoke much in the days after the attack. They didn't need to. The message had been sent loud and clear to every outlaw, mercenary, and military officer with ambitions to make a name in the frontier. Some places weren't worth the price. The cabin on the ridge was no longer just a defensive marvel. It was a deterrent, one wrapped in ash and blood, reinforced not only by traps and timber, but by the simple fact that everyone who had come to take it had failed. The raiders never returned. Not one body was left behind for identification. Caleb knew that kind of discipline only came from experience. These weren't drunkards or amateurs. These were seasoned fighters who had tested every kind of settlement, every type of wall, and this time they'd been repelled so cleanly they didn't even send scouts afterward. But Caleb also knew the silence wouldn't last. The thing about legends is they don't die quietly. They breed curiosity, ambition, and worse, politics. Stories about the cabin began to spread through the territories, no longer just whispered among trappers and scouts. Now they were written down. A traveling surveyor passing through Mesilla published a letter to a friend in Chicago, describing a fortress built by an ex-dragoon and a ghost-faced girl who who bled fire from her fingertips. Another wrote to his wife in New Orleans about a cabin so stout even the native tribes gave it a wide berth. Some called it myth, others thought it a coded reference to a hidden garrison, and then someone gave it a name. The Black Thorn, a settler from the north, coined it after seeing the burned stubs of the hedge traps and the blackened timber from the auxiliary hut. He said it looked like the valley itself had sprouted a weapon, sharp and stubborn and dangerous to touch. The name stuck, the Black Thorn. By midwinter, soldiers from Fort Craig began drifting closer, not marching, not in uniform, but scouts, observers. They camped miles off, sometimes with excuse, sometimes without. Caleb counted them with cold precision. 3 the first week, 2 more by the end of the second. One of them he recognized, a tracker named Jennings, who'd once served under Kearns. He made no effort to speak, just built a small fire outside rifle range and watched through a telescope longer than Caleb's arm. Ruth watched back every night from the high ridge where she'd hollowed out a sniper's nest under a cairn of stones. She didn't ask Caleb if she could do it. She just did it, and he didn't stop her, because he'd begun to realize something that both frightened and amazed him. She wasn't learning anymore. She was building. Her latest project was a signaling system designed to work with mirrors, slitted windows, and lenses salvaged from broken scopes. She rigged a setup that could flash coded messages between the main cabin and the ridge station a quarter-mile away. She tested it with Elijah and Asa, training them in the sequences. Dots, lines, flares, smoke plumes. It was primitive, but effective. And that wasn't all. Inside the second auxiliary hut, she began assembling what she called the backhand. It was a mechanical sling trap, part drawbridge, part lever rig, that could hurl a weighted projectile up to 40 yards with terrifying force. She used counterweights, pulleys, and carved sycamore arms. The prototype cracked on its second test and broke Asa's finger. He didn't complain. He just rewrapped the joint and kept building. Caleb watched all of this unfold with a strange mix of pride and unease. These children weren't just surviving. They were creating doctrine. If war came again, it would not be met by a man and a girl defending a stronghold. It would be met by a system, a culture, and that made them more dangerous than anything Kearns or the army had imagined. But not everyone saw it that way. One morning in February, a letter arrived, not by hand, not with a messenger, just a single envelope, pinned to the outer hedge with a rusted knife. The seal bore the mark of the U.S. Army Quartermaster's office. Inside, the message was brief. Notice of inspection. Prepare the premises for assessment and potential requisition under emergency authority. Fort Stanton Garrison. No signature, no date, just intent. Caleb read it twice, then burned it. But the message was clear. They were coming, and not with torches and wild men this time, with papers, orders, sanctioned force. That night, he gathered everyone inside the cabin. Thorne and his family, Ruth, Asa, Elijah. He laid out what was coming in plain words. "This is not a raid," he said. "It'll be uniforms, legal authority. They won't ask, they'll demand. They'll use words like requisition, public good, national interest." Thorne spat into the fire. "They got no right. They'll say otherwise. What do we do?" Ruth asked. Caleb looked at her. Her face was half shadow, half firelight, and all iron. "We show them what happens when you try to steal something built on blood." But Ruth didn't look satisfied. She stepped outside and stared into the cold dark for a long time. Then she came back in and unrolled a new drawing. "What if we don't just defend?" Caleb blinked. "What do you mean?" She pointed at the drawing. A map, not of the cabin, of the region. Trails, valleys, river routes, trade roads. "They're coming for us," she said. "So let's make sure the road here is longer than they can handle." She laid out the plan. Choke points, false trails, sabotaged bridges, message caches in hollow stones, directing friendly scouts away and enemies into dead ends. They'd make the valley a maze, not just a wall, but a labyrinth. Anyone who entered it with bad intentions would find themselves exhausted, confused, and isolated before they ever saw the cabin's roofline. They called it the Drift, and for the next month, they built it. Using animal bones, dyed strings, and mirrored stones, they crafted a signaling network across 3 miles. Each bend in the trail had its own coded marker. Friendly guides were briefed. Children were taught the signs as easily as prayer. When Fort Stanton finally sent its first detachment, they didn't even realize they'd been turned around until they'd made a full circle back to their own supply cache. Caleb watched from the ridge as the green-jacketed lieutenant cursed into the wind. They never made it to the cabin. Not that time. But the game had changed again. The Black Thorn wasn't just a place now, it was a mythos, and myths don't die easily. In early spring, a preacher came through. Older man, dusty boots, weather-worn Bible, voice like sandpaper. He didn't preach, he just sat by the perimeter and told stories to whoever would listen. Stories about a cabin where death came for no man, where angels with burned faces guarded the walls and machines wept fire from the earth. Ruth sat nearby, sharpening a blade. She never told him he was wrong, because maybe he wasn't. And Caleb, he stopped calling it a cabin. He started calling it what it had become, citadel. Not because it was impenetrable, but because it stood through everything and would keep standing. Because soon a new kind of enemy would come, not with weapons, but with laws. The arrival of the law wasn't heralded by horns or columns of soldiers, but by a man with clean boots and a clipboard. He came in alone, riding a bay gelding with federal stamps on its saddle, his coat marked with the gold piping of a quartermaster's agent. He wore spectacles and gloves, and he never once looked toward the rifle barrels that tracked him from the bluff above. Ruth had eyes on him before he ever crossed the final ridge. She watched his slow, deliberate pace, the way his hands never once touched his sidearm. He wasn't here to fight. He was here to document. That made him more dangerous. His name was Winslow. He introduced himself at the gravel line, not shouting but speaking in a measured, court-ready tone. I'm here under Article 7 of the Territorial Reclamation Act to conduct an official assessment of this land and the structure upon it. No weapons will be drawn, no accusations made. I am here to measure, report, and return. Caleb said nothing at first, just stared from the doorway, arms folded. Winslow cleared his throat. I do not intend to enter without permission. I merely require a visual inspection and to ask a series of standardized questions. Still no one moved. Then Ruth stepped from behind the wall, carbine slung, but her stance unmistakably armed. You already know what's here, she said. Winslow turned to her, smiling faintly. I know the stories. I'm here to verify which parts are true. Ruth took a step closer. You'll write what they want you to write. Winslow didn't flinch. I'll write what I see. What happens after that isn't mine to decide. That was his shield, neutrality. But neutrality was just another kind of weapon. Caleb eventually let him walk the perimeter, shadowed closely by Asa and Elijah, who said nothing and made sure he touched nothing. Winslow made notes, a lot of them. He measured angles with brass tools, sketched diagrams, traced the blast patterns still faintly visible in the outer trench wall from the raider attack. He asked questions, never aggressive, but insistent. What kind of mortar was used here? Where did the iron strapping come from? Why does the southern wall have sloped braces instead of verticals? Caleb gave short answers, some true, some vague. By mid-afternoon, Winslow closed his notebook and nodded once. I've seen enough. He turned to Caleb then, something shifting in his posture. They'll come, he said. Maybe not this year, maybe not next. But a structure like this, it changes the balance. Caleb said nothing. Winslow hesitated. If you dismantled it yourself, piece by piece, left the valley, there's a chance they'd let it be. But if you stay, if you keep expanding, this becomes a precedent. Ruth stepped forward, voice like flint. That's the point. Winslow's eyes lingered on her for a moment. Then he nodded, as if understanding something deeper. When he left, he didn't look back. That night, Caleb sat long by the fire. He wasn't afraid of soldiers or politicians. He'd fought under men like them, watched their bravado collapse under the first real loss. But institutions, those were harder to fight. A man with a gun could be outmaneuvered. A bureaucracy couldn't be flanked. It came like floodwater, slow, inevitable, and indifferent. He spoke to Ruth quietly. When the next ones come, it won't be just scouts. They'll have deeds, maps, maybe even arrest papers. Ruth was staring at her latest schematic, a redesign of the main flue to convert it into a dual-direction exhaust, allowing smoke to be routed underground and released half a mile away through hollowed logs painted to blend with tree bark. Then we don't let them get close, she said. But it wasn't just a matter of repelling visitors anymore. It was about legacy. They had built something unprecedented. Not a fort, not a homestead, a prototype. And now it was being noticed. The threat wasn't only external, it was philosophical. Because if this was possible, if two outcasts could build a structure that defied weather, raiders, military force, and time, then why hadn't others done the same? That question was spreading. It challenged every established method of frontier expansion, every doctrine taught at Fort Leavenworth, every pattern of waste and weakness that settlers took for granted. Caleb hadn't meant to start a movement, but he had. The proof came the next month. 3 more families, 1 from the north, 2 from the east. They didn't ask to stay. They asked to learn. They'd heard about the Black Thorn, heard it had survived everything, heard that no one who lived within its shadow had died since it was built. They wanted the blueprints, the methods, the how. Caleb was hesitant. This had never been about sharing, but Ruth was already drawing. She brought the families into the auxiliary hut and taught them about triple-chinked gaps, about recessed windows and counterlevered doors. She taught them to pack insulation with moss and ash, to build kill zones disguised as welcome yards. She showed them how to layer their floors so that warmth stayed and noise vanished. Within weeks, they had replicated the outer shell of the cabin 50 yards down the valley. Not perfect, but strong, and that was the beginning. The idea was out now, free. Caleb knew then that the war had already changed. No longer a battle for territory. It was a battle for architecture, for the right to shape the land without permission, for the right to build not just shelter, but resistance. The army sent another messenger in May. This one didn't approach, just left a crate at the outer marker and rode away. Inside, a new letter, longer this time, more official. It contained 3 things: a formal notice of inspection record, a summary of proposed requisition terms, a map, but it wasn't a map of the Black Thorn. It was a blueprint of the same design, same triangular foundation, same recessed wall lines, same split flue, but built at a different location, 100 miles south. They had copied it. Caleb stared at it for a long time, then handed it to Ruth. She read it, didn't say anything for a while. Then, so they want to build their own. They already have. She traced the lines of the blueprint, but they missed the point. What point? She looked up at him. Her face was harder now. Not cruel, but exact. This place wasn't just built to survive. It was built to warn, and she was right. Because the Black Thorn wasn't just timber and stone anymore. It was message. It said, you can survive without them. You can build without permission. You can thrive without submitting. The next stage began without ceremony. Asa took to the road with Thorn's eldest. They carried a leather-bound ledger, Ruth's compiled blueprints, and began visiting other settlements, not to recruit, to educate. They taught people how to read the land before cutting into it, how to channel heat instead of fighting it, how to disguise smoke, and how to make a single bullet count for 10. Some places embraced it, others reported it, but the seeds had been sown. Caleb remained behind, so did Ruth. They continued building. They weren't just defending anymore, they were outlasting. The Black Thorn began to disappear beneath brush. The roof was camouflaged further. The stone flue was coated in mud and moss. Trails were rerouted, markers removed. To an outsider, it looked like abandonment, but inside, they were planting a new kind of trap, not for men, for systems. They laid caches of knowledge, sealed crates of diagrams, journals, tools, buried deep in marked sites, coded for those who knew the signs. If the Black Thorn fell, its ideas would survive. One night, as the moon climbed high and the air turned sharp with summer cool, Ruth stood outside the door with a rolled canvas in her arms. "What's that?" Caleb asked. She unrolled it. A flag, not of a nation, of a threshold, a black circle on a red field, a cabin silhouette at the center, and above it, the same word she'd carved so long ago, "Twogi enough." She staked it at the gravel line. Caleb didn't stop her, because it was true. By the time summer tipped into fall, the Black Thorn had become more than just a stronghold hidden in a crooked valley east of the Organ Mountains. It had become myth, not the kind written in books, not the kind sketched in eastern newspapers by men who'd never felt prairie wind, or knelt in snow at dusk with a half-loaded rifle and only 2 rounds left. This myth was living, breathing, growing through root and rumor, and the breath of people who had walked its trenches and touched its stone. Some swore that the cabin had walls laced with gold wiring, an old telegraph system, they said, that let it call for help with a touch. Others said Ruth wasn't a girl at all anymore, but some spirit in flesh, the final soul left after her family's murder, protected by the place she'd chosen not to leave. Some even claimed that Caleb had died and been buried beneath the stones at the center of the floor, and the man who patrolled the grounds now was a ghost made from rage and ash and sorrow. Caleb didn't care. Let them talk. The truth in some ways was even stranger, because the Black Thorn had become an idea, and ideas were more dangerous than fire. By early October, fragments of Ruth's designs had spread as far west as Tucson. A scout returned from the Salt River Valley and told of a cabin built so low into the land it vanished during sunrise, with walls lined in overlapping bark, 4 chimneys disguised as dead, trees, and a perimeter so layered in decoys that a man could ride straight into it and never see the real entrance. Another trapper swore he'd seen a group of children in Durango drawing floor plans into the dirt with sticks, whispering about Ruth's firebox design and the weight ratios needed to support stone ceilings without collapse. Ruth's journal had become scripture, passed hand to hand, copied into ledgers, and memorized by men who'd never seen her face. And the army? They were losing the thread. They'd tried to steal the plans, then tried to replicate them. Now they were trying to to legislate them. A new act passed through the territorial offices that September, the Domestic Fortification Regulation Clause, Article C, barring any privately owned structure from maintaining military-grade reinforcement without federal approval. Anyone with thick walls and a cellar now risked inspection. But inspections meant little when the ideas no longer had a center. Ruth had made sure of that. The Blackthorn wasn't an outpost anymore. It was a movement, and movements were hard to kill. But Caleb had seen the end coming long before anyone else had. Not a bloody end, not a fire and bullets end. A quiet one. The kind that comes like rot under your floorboards, slow and steady and invisible, until the whole structure creaks. It began with the boy, Asa. He came back from one of his teaching circuits not with injuries, but with news that soldiers had begun constructing new stations patterned after Ruth's designs. Not exact copies, but close. A new post near Fort Bayard had the same flu system. A forward scout camp in Arizona Territory had adopted the gravel warning field and triangulated blast pits. They'd watched, they'd listened, they'd adapted. The very people who'd once come to burn the place had started to learn from it. Caleb wasn't surprised. He just sat with the ledger Asa handed him and flipped through the ink drawings. New symbols, new tweaks, annotations in unfamiliar hands. Ruth's firebox now paired with an insulation method from the high Andes. Her counter-levered walls refined by an engineer who'd never seen combat. The ideas were no longer Ruth's, no longer his. They belonged to everyone now. That night, Caleb sat by the hearth in silence while Ruth placed fresh moss between the stones of the rear flue. The others were asleep. The cabin was quiet. The only sound, the pop and hiss of cedar sap bursting in the flames. Caleb finally spoke. "It's time." Ruth paused, looked up. Her hands were black with clay and lichen. "You mean to leave?" "No, I mean to finish." She didn't answer right away, but in her eyes something gave. Not fear, not resistance, but understanding. They didn't need to guard the Blackthorn anymore. They needed to seal it. Over the next 3 weeks, they worked without pause. No one outside the circle understood what was happening. The new families thought it was another upgrade. Scouts passed by and reported no signs of change. But something fundamental was shifting. Caleb dismantled the flue cap and replaced it with a false one, camouflaged, untraceable. Ruth tore up the floorboards beneath the eastern wall and dug a trench that led nowhere but appeared to connect to a tunnel system. Asa moved every remaining cache of powder into the auxiliary hut, then disassembled the support beams so it would collapse under its own weight if disturbed. They weren't just reinforcing, they were vanishing. But the core of the cabin, the original room, the stones that had held warmth for 7 winters, the timbers stripped of bark and shaped by hand, remained untouched. It would stay, as monument, as warning, as proof, and finally, as tombstone. The last night they sat in silence. Ruth, Asa, Elijah, Thorne, the others. Caleb stood by the door, rifle across his back, fingers resting on the smooth, worn handle of the flint knife he hadn't drawn in over a year. Ruth stood beside him. "You ready?" she asked. He didn't nod. He didn't need to. At dawn, they buried the entrance. They didn't burn it. They didn't collapse it. They simply sealed it with stone, earth, and silence. Grass was laid over the trench. Wild brush was replanted at the corners. The ridge trail was disguised with misleading markers. And when it was done, there was no sign of the Blackthorn, only an empty patch of earth. And the flag, the red and black one. Ruth rolled it carefully, tied it shut, then placed it inside a sealed crate and buried it beneath an aspen tree, roots like fingers holding it close. And they left, not as refugees, as carriers of something that could not be killed. In the years that followed, legends multiplied. People swore they saw the cabin reappear in the fog, that the girl with the scarred face had become a marshal, riding the borderlands and teaching children how to fortify dirt with nothing but ash and bone. Others said Caleb had returned to Florida to die beneath the trees where he'd once learned to fight. No one really knew, because myths don't have graves, only beginnings, and the Blackthorn, it was only the first, a seed in stone, a lesson written in splinters and smoke, that when the world tries to take everything from you, your land, your safety, your name, you build something so unbreakable even the wild backs away.